The screen didn't just turn red. It bled across the glass like a warning no one in the room could ignore. The numbers pulsed in silence, each digit flickering under the cold LED glow as if the system itself was struggling to breathe. And Ethan Caldwell didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even shift his weight as the final projection locked into place above the long obsidian table, a cascade of losses, liabilities, and collapsing projections stacked in neat, merciless rows. The kind that didn't just suggest failure, but announced it with precision. Someone cleared their throat at the far end, a dry, careful sound that broke against the tension like a pebble against glass. And then the voice came, steady but low, almost respectful in its delivery. We're 48 hours from collapse, and the words didn't echo. They settled, heavy, deliberate, as if the room itself had been waiting to say them out loud. Outside, Manhattan moved the way it always did. Relentless, headlights threading through the avenues, distant sirens rising and falling. But up here on the 42nd floor, the world had narrowed to a single point of truth, and that truth had Ethan standing at the head of a table built for control with nothing left to control. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that didn't release tension so much as acknowledge it, and his gaze shifted from the screen to the men and women seated around him, each one polished, successful, carefully composed. And yet beneath their tailored jackets and measured expressions, there was something else now. Something quieter, colder, the early stages of retreat. His CFO avoided eye contact first, fingers tapping once against a tablet before going still, and then the legal advisor leaned back just enough to create distance, not physical, but strategic, the kind that said decisions were already being reconsidered. Ethan noticed everything. He always did. That had been the difference. The edge that built Caldwell Dynamics into something untouchable, something that didn't bend under pressure. Until now, a notification buzzed softly against the table, then another, then three more in rapid succession, each vibration a reminder that the outside world was already reacting, already dissecting, already preparing headlines that would strip this moment down to something digestible, something final. He didn't pick up the phone, not yet. Because the truth didn't need confirmation, it was already here, projected in red across tempered glass. We still have options, someone said, too quickly, the words landing with the wrong weight, like they had been rehearsed but not believed, and Ethan's eyes shifted toward the speaker without. Turning his head, a subtle movement, precise, controlled, the kind that used to silence a room before he even spoke, but this time it didn't hold the same authority, not because he had changed, but because the circumstances had. Silence stretched, long enough to feel intentional, long enough for everyone to understand that whatever came next would define more than just a company. And Ethan finally reached forward, tapping once against the table to dim the projection, the red glow fading into a muted reflection of the skyline beyond the glass walls. List them, he said, his voice even, unhurried, but there was a texture beneath it now, something tighter, less certain, and the head of strategy straightened slightly, pulling up a file, outlining potential acquisitions, emergency capital injections, asset liquidation pathways, each one more desperate than the last, each one trading control for survival. Ethan listened without interruption, absorbing every detail, every angle, every compromise being suggested, and with each option laid out, something inside him settled, not panic, not fear, but clarity. The kind that came when illusions finally fell away. By the time the last proposal was presented, the room had grown quieter, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everyone understood what had been said. That's not a solution, Ethan said finally, his tone calm but definitive, and he leaned back slightly, eyes moving once more to the glass wall where the city reflected in fractured layers. Lights overlapping like 1,000 separate realities coexisting without ever touching. The meeting ended not with a decision, but with a pause, a temporary suspension of something inevitable, and one by one they stood, gathering devices, adjusting cuffs, avoiding prolonged eye contact as they moved toward the exit, their footsteps soft against the carpet, measured, controlled, like they were leaving a room that might collapse if disturbed too quickly. The door closed with a quiet click, and just like that, the silence changed, no longer shared, no longer strategic, just empty. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer before standing, his reflection catching in the glass, sharp lines, tailored suit, the image of a man who had built something unshakable. Except now the reflection felt thinner, like it belonged to a version of him that had existed before this moment. His phone buzzed again, persistent now, insistent, and he picked it up, glancing at the screen long enough to read the first line of a headline before locking it again. Face unreadable. He didn't need confirmation from the outside world. He could already feel the shift, the way power redistributed itself when weakness was exposed, the way alliances dissolved the second they became inconvenient. He turned away from the table, walking toward the elevator, each step measured, controlled, the same way he had always moved through crisis. Except this time the rhythm felt different, heavier, like something was missing, or perhaps something had finally caught up. The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent except for the soft hum of machinery, and when the doors opened, the city greeted him with its usual indifference, lights stretching out in every direction, a reminder that no single story ever stopped the world from moving. Inside, the space was immaculate, curated down to the smallest detail, every surface reflecting intention, success, control, and yet the silence here was deeper, more personal, pressing in around him as he loosened his tie and set his phone down on the marble counter. He moved toward the window, hands resting lightly against the cool glass, eyes scanning the skyline without really seeing it. And for the first time in years, there was no immediate plan forming, no sequence of moves aligning into certainty, just a quiet space where answers used to be. A faint sound broke through the stillness, subtle, almost forgettable, the soft rustle of paper from somewhere behind him, and Ethan turned slightly, his gaze landing on a small stack of documents he had left untouched for days, buried beneath contracts and reports, something older, something irrelevant, and yet something about it pulled his attention in a way the crisis hadn't. He walked over slowly, picking up the top sheet, fingers brushing against the worn edge, and for a brief moment, the room shifted, not physically, but in memory, the polished surfaces fading beneath something colder, wetter, a different night entirely, one that didn't belong in this world of glass and steel. He exhaled again, quieter this time, and his grip tightened just slightly on the paper as the edges of that memory began to form, uninvited but undeniable, like a story that had been waiting for the right moment to be remembered. And somewhere beneath the weight of collapsing numbers and failing systems, a single thought surfaced, quiet but persistent, the kind that didn't demand attention but refused to be ignored. Not everything that saved you looked like power when it first appeared. The paper felt thinner than it should have, like time had worn it down without touching it, and Ethan Caldwell stood there in the quiet glow of his penthouse, holding something that had no place in a world measured by billion-dollar valuations and quarterly forecasts. Yet somehow it carried more weight than everything projected on that red screen hours earlier. He turned it slightly, the overhead light catching the faded ink, and for a moment he did not see the present. He saw rain, not the controlled kind that streaked neatly down glass, but the kind that fell hard and uneven, bouncing off concrete, soaking through fabric, blurring the edges of everything that tried to stay defined. 8 years earlier, the city had looked different from the street, louder, closer, less forgiving, and Ethan had not been the man people recognized on magazine covers. He had been someone on the edge of becoming, someone who still walked without an entourage, without a driver, without the quiet barrier that wealth eventually built between a person and everything else. It had been late, close to midnight, the kind of hour where restaurants were closing and decisions were shorter, sharper, less patient, and he remembered stepping out into the cold with his coat unbuttoned, his phone pressed to his ear, half listening to a conversation about investors while scanning the street for a car that had not arrived yet. The first thing he noticed was not her face. It was the stillness, a kind of stillness that did not belong in motion, a figure standing just outside the reach of the restaurant light, rain collecting along the edges of her sleeves, dripping from her hair, but she was not moving, not pacing, not pleading, just standing there as if leaving would cost more than staying. The door behind him swung open again, a burst of warm air and voices spilling out, and someone inside said something sharp, dismissive, followed by a short laugh that ended too quickly, and then the door closed, sealing the moment outside with the rain. Ethan lowered his phone without ending the call, his attention shifting fully now, because there was something about the way she held herself that did not match the situation. No visible panic, no desperation, just a quiet kind of resistance, like she had already decided what she would not do regardless of what happened next. He stepped closer, just enough to bring her into clearer view. And that was when he saw her eyes, steady, focused, not avoiding him, but not inviting him either. And for a second he hesitated, not because he did not know what to say, but because he realized this was not a moment that could be handled with routine gestures or casual sympathy. They closed early, she said before he could speak, her voice calm, even, as if she were stating a fact that did not require explanation, and he glanced toward the restaurant door, then back at her, understanding more from what she did not say than what she did. You were working there, he said, not as a question, and she nodded once, a small movement, controlled, as if she refused to let the situation define her posture. The rain picked up, heavier now, tapping against the sidewalk, and Ethan looked down briefly, noticing the thin fabric of her shoes, the way water had already seeped through, but she did not shift her weight, did not try to shield herself, and that detail settled something in him, something that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with recognition. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his wallet, but paused before opening it, because this was not about handing over money and walking away. That would have been easier, cleaner, forgettable, and something about her made that option feel wrong. Do you have somewhere to go? He asked instead, and she held his gaze for a second longer before answering. Not tonight. And there was no tremor in her voice, no attempt to soften the truth or make it more acceptable, just a direct statement that carried its own weight. A car passed by, headlights cutting through the rain, and Ethan stepped slightly to the side, shielding her from the splash of water that followed, an instinctive movement he barely registered until after it happened. He exhaled once, slow, then made a decision that did not come from calculation, but from something simpler, something he had not yet learned to ignore. Come inside, he said, nodding toward the restaurant, and she did not move immediately, her eyes narrowing just slightly, not in suspicion, but in assessment, as if she were measuring the offer against something internal, something that mattered more than comfort. I am not asking for anything, he added, his tone steady, leaving no space for misunderstanding. And that seemed to shift something, not dramatically, just enough for her to step forward, one step, then another, following him back toward the door. Inside, the warmth hit first, followed by the smell of cleaning solutions and the faint echo of conversation from the staff finishing their shift, and the manager looked up, surprised, then confused, but Ethan did not pause, did not explain. He simply moved with quiet authority toward a table near the back, gesturing for her to sit. She hesitated again, just for a second, then lowered herself into the chair, posture straight, hands resting lightly in her lap, still composed, still controlled, even as water dripped softly onto the floor beneath her. Ethan spoke briefly to the manager, low enough to keep the moment contained, arranging something that did not need to be negotiated, and within minutes a towel was brought, followed by a plate of food that had not yet been cleared away, and she looked at it, then at him, not with gratitude, but with something deeper, something more deliberate. You do not have to do this, she said quietly, and he met her gaze without hesitation. I know. And that was all. No explanation, no justification, just the truth of it. She picked up the fork slowly, as if the action itself carried meaning, and began to eat. Not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, controlled, the same way she had stood outside in the rain, and Ethan watched for a moment longer before sitting across from her, the distance between them small but defined, like two separate worlds intersecting for reasons neither of them fully understood yet. What is your name? He asked after a while, and she swallowed before answering. Amara. And the name settled into the space between them, simple, unadorned, and he nodded once, committing it to memory without realizing he was doing it. I will not waste this, she said suddenly, the words clear, firm, not directed at him as much as spoken into the moment itself, and Ethan felt something shift again, something quiet but undeniable, because it was not a promise made for approval, it was a decision, already made. The rain outside continued, relentless, but inside the air had changed, not warmer, not lighter, just different, as if something small but permanent had just taken place, something that would not announce itself now, but would not disappear either. Back in the present, Ethan lowered the paper slightly, the edges of that night still sharp in his mind, the details clearer than they should have been after all this time. And he realized, standing there in a penthouse that overlooked a city that had never once slowed down for him, that the moment he had just remembered was not significant because of what he had given, but because of what she had taken from it, and how completely she had carried it forward. The memory did not fade when he set the paper down. It lingered, quiet but persistent, threading itself through the present in a way Ethan Caldwell had not experienced in years, and he stood there for a long moment before finally moving again, placing the document carefully back on the counter as if it carried more than ink and fiber, as if it held a version of him that had not been shaped entirely by strategy and outcomes. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, but inside the penthouse the silence had shifted, no longer empty but occupied by something unresolved, something that did not belong to balance sheets or negotiations, and he ran a hand slowly along the edge of the marble surface, grounding himself in the present even as his thoughts refused to stay there. He had not followed her story after that night, not out of indifference, but because life had accelerated, pulling him forward into a series of decisions that demanded focus and left little room for reflection. And yet now, standing on the edge of losing everything he had built, that single moment returned with a clarity that felt deliberate, almost timed. His phone vibrated again, more aggressively this time, and when he finally picked it up, the screen was filled with missed calls, messages, alerts from executives, analysts, reporters, each one carrying urgency, expectation, pressure, and he scrolled briefly before selecting one call and lifting the phone to his ear. "Talk to me," he said, his voice steady, controlled, and the response came quickly, outlining numbers, projections, the reality that liquidity was evaporating faster than anticipated, that key partners were hesitating, that the window to stabilize the situation was closing by the hour, and Ethan listened without interruption, absorbing each detail, each implication, his expression unchanged even as the weight of it settled deeper. "We need a buyer," the voice said finally, the word landing with a finality that did not invite alternatives, and Ethan turned toward the window again, his reflection merging with the lights beyond as he considered the statement, not emotionally, not defensively, but analytically, because that was how he had always navigated pressure, by reducing it to variables, to choices, to controlled outcomes. "Not just any buyer," he replied after a moment, his tone low but precise. "Someone who can move fast, someone who does not need approval to act." And there was a brief pause on the other end before the answer came. Hesitant but clear, "There is one." And something in the way it was said made Ethan shift slightly, attention sharpening. "Who?" he asked, and the name that followed was unfamiliar, not part of his established network, not someone who had crossed his radar in previous negotiations, and that alone was enough to create a flicker of interest, because in his world, power was rarely invisible. "They have been acquiring assets quietly for the past 3 years, the voice continued. Tech, infrastructure, logistics, all under separate entities. But it traces back to one central holding group." And Ethan's gaze narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, as pieces began to align, not fully, not clearly, but enough to suggest something deliberate behind the pattern. "Set the meeting," he said, cutting through the explanation with a decision that came without hesitation, because time was no longer a resource he could manage. It was something he had to move against. The call ended shortly after, replaced by a new silence that felt different from before, more active, more charged. And Ethan placed the phone down again, his mind already shifting into motion, mapping possibilities, outcomes, contingencies, the familiar structure of control beginning to rebuild itself piece by piece. He moved toward the study, a space designed for clarity, for decisions, for the kind of thinking that had defined his rise. And as he stepped inside, the subtle scent of leather and wood grounding him further, he noticed something on the desk that had not been there before, a small envelope, unmarked, placed precisely at the center, as if it had been waiting for Him. He paused, not out of caution, but because the timing felt too exact to ignore, and he reached forward slowly. Picking it up, the paper heavier than it looked, the seal unbroken. There was no name on the outside, no branding, nothing to indicate its origin, and yet something about it felt connected, not logically, not visibly, but intuitively, like a thread that had been drawn from the past into this moment. He opened it carefully, sliding the contents out with controlled movements, and inside was a single card, thick, minimal, with a date, a time, and an address printed in clean, deliberate type. No explanation, no introduction, just information. He studied it for a second longer than necessary, the simplicity of it standing in contrast to the complexity of everything else unfolding around him. And then he turned the card over, expecting nothing, but finding a single line printed on the back, small, almost understated, and yet it shifted the air in the room the moment he read it. "You said respect matters more than rescue," the line read, and Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the card, not enough to crease it, just enough to register the impact, because that was not a phrase that existed anywhere in his public life, not something that could be traced through interviews or statements or corporate messaging. It was something spoken once, in a moment that had not been recorded, not been shared, not been meant to last beyond that night. He stood there, the card in his hand, the memory fully present now, not as a distant recollection but as something immediate, something connected to what was happening, and for the first time since the numbers had turned red, the situation in front of him did not feel like a collapse, it felt like a convergence. He placed the card back on the desk with deliberate care, his mind no longer searching for options but focusing on a single point, a meeting that had not yet happened but already carried weight, and he adjusted his cuff slightly, a small, habitual movement that signaled readiness more than comfort. Outside, the city continued without pause, but inside, something had shifted again, not in the direction of certainty, but towards something else, something that did not fit neatly into strategy or control, something that required him to step into a space where outcomes were not entirely his to dictate. He exhaled slowly, his gaze settling on the address once more, and without hesitation, he reached for his phone, not to call, not to confirm, but to clear everything else from the next 48 hours, because whatever waited at that location was no longer just an option. It was the moment everything had been leading toward, whether he had realized it or not. The address did not belong to the part of the city where deals were usually made, and that alone was enough to change the rhythm of Ethan Caldwell's thoughts as the car slowed along a quieter stretch of Manhattan where glass towers gave way to older buildings that carried history in their brick and stone. Structures that had been repurposed over decades into spaces that did not need to announce their value because the people inside already understood it. The driver pulled to a stop without a word, and Ethan stepped out into the cool air, the sound of traffic softer here, more distant, as if the city itself respected the boundary of whatever operated behind these walls. He adjusted his coat slightly, eyes lifting to take in the building in front of him. No visible signage, no branding. Just a clean entrance framed by subtle lighting, the kind that guided rather than displayed, and for a brief moment he remained still, not out of hesitation, but because something about the simplicity of it all suggested intention, a level of control that mirrored his own but expressed in a completely different way. Inside, the lobby was quiet, not empty, but curated, every detail placed with purpose, from the soft lighting that reflected off polished stone floors to the absence of unnecessary movement, and a receptionist stood behind a desk that did not dominate the space but anchored it, her posture composed, her expression neutral but attentive. "Mr. Caldwell," she said before he could speak, her voice calm, precise, as if his arrival had been anticipated down to the second, and he gave a slight nod, acknowledging the efficiency without commenting on it. "This way," she added, stepping out from behind the desk and guiding him toward a private elevator set slightly apart from the main bank. And as the doors opened, Ethan noticed the lack of buttons inside. No panel to select floors, no visible controls, just a seamless interior that suggested the destination had already been decided. The doors closed softly behind him, and the elevator began to move without sound, without the subtle shifts that usually marked descent, and he stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes forward, allowing the moment to unfold without forcing interpretation, because whatever this was, it operated on a different set of rules than the ones he had mastered. When the doors opened again, the space beyond was larger than expected, a private floor that stretched into an open layout of glass, steel, and warm wood tones, the city visible in every direction but somehow quieter from this height, as if distance created its own kind of silence. A long table stood near the center, not as imposing as the one in his own boardroom, but no less intentional. And a single chair was positioned at one end, already occupied. Ethan stepped forward, the sound of his shoes muted against the flooring, and for a second, the light shifted just enough to obscure the figure's features, turning her into a silhouette framed by the skyline behind her. And then he moved one step closer, and the details came into focus. She did not stand immediately, did not rush to greet him. She remained seated, composed, hands resting lightly on the table, her posture straight but unforced. And there was a stillness about her that felt familiar, not in appearance, not in setting, but in presence, the same quiet resistance he had noticed years ago in the rain. Ethan stopped a few feet from the table, his gaze steady, controlled, but there was something beneath it now, something less certain, because recognition does not always arrive as a clear moment. Sometimes it builds, piece by piece, until the truth becomes unavoidable. She looked at him then, fully, directly, and there was no hesitation in her eyes, no question, no need to confirm what she already knew. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm weight he remembered, only deeper now, shaped by time and experience. "You made it," she said, not as a greeting, not as an observation, but as a statement that carried its own meaning, and Ethan felt the final piece settle into place. "Amara," he said, the name leaving his mouth slower than he intended, as if saying it acknowledged something larger than just recognition, and she inclined her head slightly, not in surprise, but in acceptance. "You remember," she replied, and there was no satisfaction in her tone, no pride, just a quiet confirmation, and Ethan allowed himself a small, measured exhale, the kind that signaled understanding rather than relief. "I remember enough," he said, his voice even, but his eyes did not leave hers, because what stood in front of him now was not the girl from 8 years ago, not the figure in the rain holding on to dignity with nothing else. This was someone who had taken that moment and built something from it, something structured, controlled, powerful in a way that did not need to declare itself. She gestured lightly toward the chair across from her, a simple movement, but one that established the dynamic without needing explanation, and Ethan took the seat without hesitation, adjusting his jacket as he did, settling into the space with the same composure he carried into every negotiation, even as he understood that this was not a negotiation he fully controlled. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them not empty, but deliberate, filled with the weight of everything that had led to this point, and Ethan allowed it, did not rush to fill it, because he had learned that silence often revealed more than words when used correctly. Finally, Amara reached forward, sliding a thin folder across the table, the motion smooth, precise, and Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to it before returning to her face, as if confirming that whatever was inside had already been decided. "Your company is not failing," she said, her tone steady, her words measured. "It is being outpaced," and the distinction settled into the space between them with quiet authority, reframing the entire narrative in a way that shifted responsibility without assigning blame. Ethan opened the folder slowly, scanning the contents, projections, acquisition paths, restructuring models, each one detailed, deliberate, and built on a level of insight that suggested not just observation, but involvement. And as he turned each page, the pattern became clear. This was not a last-minute intervention. It was something that had been prepared long before the collapse became visible. He looked up again, meeting her gaze, and for the first time since stepping into the building, there was a question in his eyes, not of doubt, but of scope. "How long?" he asked, his voice lower now, more focused, and she held his gaze without shifting. "Long enough," she answered, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any specific timeline could have. Ethan leaned back slightly, the folder still open in his hands, and for a moment, the room seemed to narrow to just the two of them, the city outside fading into a distant blur, because what he was facing now was not just a solution to his problem. It was the result of a decision made years ago, one that had been carried forward, expanded, and returned to him in a form he had never anticipated. "You built this," he said, not as a compliment, not as an assumption, but as a recognition of what was in front of him, and Amara's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a quiet acknowledgement of the statement. "I built what I needed," she replied, her voice calm, controlled, and the distinction was clear. This was not about proving something to him. It was about fulfilling something within herself. The silence returned again, deeper this time, heavier, because now the dynamic had fully shifted, and Ethan understood, not intellectually, but instinctively, that whatever happened next would not be determined by leverage or negotiation, but by something else entirely, something that had been set in motion long before he realized he would need it. The weight of the folder in Ethan Caldwell's hands no longer felt like paper. It felt like consequence, layered and precise, each page a reflection of decisions he had made and the ones he had not seen coming. And he closed it slowly, placing it flat against the table as his gaze lifted back to Amara, who had not shifted, had not leaned forward or back, had not tried to read his reaction, because she did not need to. She already understood the position he was in. The city stretched behind her in quiet clarity, lights steady, indifferent, and for the first time since the collapse had begun, Ethan did not feel the urgency to speak immediately, because whatever this moment was, it required something different from the pace he had built his life around. "You have been preparing for this," he said finally, his voice low, not accusing, not impressed, just stating what had become obvious, and Amara's eyes held his without hesitation. "I prepared for possibilities," she replied, the distinction landing with quiet precision, and Ethan nodded once, absorbing it, because it was the kind of answer that did not exaggerate, did not claim more than it needed to, and yet revealed everything about how she operated. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture controlled but no longer rigid, and his eyes moved briefly to the skyline, before returning to her, as if measuring the scale of what stood between them now, not as individuals, but as outcomes of time. "You knew it would come to this," he said, and this time there was a question beneath the statement, subtle but present, and Amara allowed a small pause before answering, not to create tension, but because she chose her words with intention. "I knew you would reach a point where control alone would not be enough," she said, her tone calm, and Ethan felt something settle in his chest, not resistance, not denial, but recognition, because the truth in her words did not challenge him. It completed something he had already begun to understand. He exhaled slowly, fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, and for a moment, the room felt smaller, more contained, as if everything beyond it had stepped back to allow this exchange to take shape. "And now," he said, his voice quieter, more measured, "you are the one holding the solution," and it was. Not a question, not even a negotiation point. It was an acknowledgement, and Amara inclined her head slightly, accepting it without emphasis. "I am holding one version of it," she replied, and Ethan's gaze sharpened. Just slightly, because that was where the real shift lay, not in the fact that she could help, but in the fact that she did not need to. Silence moved between them again, but this time it carried a different weight, not tension, not uncertainty, but clarity. The kind that comes when both sides understand exactly where they stand without needing to say it out loud. Ethan straightened slightly, his posture aligning with something more grounded, more present, and he folded his hands loosely in front of him, not as a defensive gesture, but as a signal that he was no longer approaching this from the position he had always occupied. "What do you want?" he asked, the words simple, direct, stripped of anything unnecessary, and for the first time since he had entered the room, Amara's expression shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who did not know what to look for, but enough to suggest that the question itself mattered more than the answer. She did not respond immediately, and the pause that followed was not hesitation. It was consideration, the kind that comes from knowing that what is said next will define more than just the outcome of a deal. She placed her hands together lightly on the table, her fingers still, her posture unchanged, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same steady control, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something rooted in years rather than moments. "I do not want your company," she said, and the statement landed with quiet finality, unexpected not because it lacked logic, but because it removed the most obvious leverage from the equation. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, because that answer did not simplify the situation, it made it more complex. "Then why step in at all?" he asked, and this time the question carried more weight, not just strategic, but personal, because the connection between past and present had already been established, and what remained was understanding. The intention behind it. Amara's gaze did not waver, and for a moment, the city lights behind her seemed to dim, not physically, but in relevance, as if the only thing that mattered was the space between them and the truth being shaped within it. "Because what you built matters," she said, her voice calm, unembellished, and Ethan felt the words register in a place he had not expected, not as validation, not as flattery, but as something closer to alignment. She continued without raising her tone, without adding emphasis. "And because you were the first person who showed me that help does not have to come with a cost." And the air in the room shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as the past stepped fully into the present, not as a memory, but as a foundation. Ethan held her gaze, the weight of that night 8 years ago now reframed, not as a small act of kindness, but as the beginning of something neither of them had understood at the time, and he nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "That was not a strategy," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reflective, and Amara allowed the faintest hint of a smile, not visible enough to change her expression, but enough to soften the edge of the moment. "No," she replied. "It was not." And the simplicity of it carried more meaning than any explanation could have. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, layered with everything that had led them here, and Ethan felt something shift within himself, something that had nothing to do with control or outcome, something closer to acceptance. "Then what happens next?" he asked, and this time there was no pretense in the question, no attempt to frame it within a negotiation, just a direct step forward into whatever this had become. Amara leaned back slightly, not to create distance, but to see him more clearly, and her eyes remained steady, grounded in something that did not need to prove itself. "Now," she said, her voice calm, certain, "we rebuild it properly." And the word "we" did not echo, did not demand attention, but it settled into the space between them with quiet significance, because it was not offered lightly, and it was not given freely. It was placed there with intention, as both an opportunity and a boundary. Ethan absorbed it without immediate response, the implications unfolding in layers, not just for his company, but for the dynamic that had formed between them, and he realized, sitting there across from her, that the moment he had walked into was not about being saved, it was about being redefined, and that realization did not feel like a loss. It felt like something else entirely, something he had not anticipated but could not ignore. The word "we" did not dissolve into comfort. It settled with structure, with weight, and Ethan Caldwell remained still for a moment after she said it, as if measuring not the offer itself, but everything it required him to become in order to accept it. And outside the glass walls the city continued without pause. But inside the room the pace had shifted again, no longer driven by urgency, but by intention. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, the movement subtle but deliberate, signaling engagement not dominance, and his eyes did not leave Amara's as he spoke. "Then we do it your way." And the sentence was simple, controlled, but it carried something that had not existed in him before this moment. Not surrender, not agreement, but a conscious decision to step out of the position he had always occupied. Amara watched him without reacting immediately, her gaze steady, not searching for weakness, not testing his words, just observing the alignment between what he said and how he held himself. And after a brief pause, she nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, but enough to move the moment forward. She reached for the folder again, opening it with precise movements, and turned it slightly so they could both see the contents, not as a gesture of collaboration, but as a clear statement that whatever came next would be built in transparency, not control. "Your structure is too centralized," she said, her tone even, as if she were describing something mechanical rather than personal. Everything routes through you, which means everything slows when pressure builds. And Ethan did not interrupt, did not defend, because the truth of it was evident, not just in the data, but in the way the collapse had unfolded. You built efficiency, she continued, but not resilience. And the distinction landed with quiet clarity, reframing years of decisions in a single line. And Ethan felt the impact of it not as criticism, but as correction. He glanced down at the projections again, seeing them now through a different lens, not as failures, but as indicators of a system that had reached its limit. And he nodded once, slow, measured. So we decentralize, he said, his voice calm, already moving into solution. But Amara lifted a hand slightly, not to stop him, but to redirect the pace. We restructure, she replied, and the difference was immediate, subtle, but important, because decentralizing implied adjustment, while restructuring implied transformation. She turned another page, revealing a model that shifted authority across multiple divisions, each one capable of operating independently while still aligned under a larger framework. And Ethan studied it carefully, recognizing the elegance in its simplicity, the way it removed bottlenecks without creating chaos. You have already tested this, he said, more statement than question, and Amara inclined her head slightly. Across 3 separate entities, she confirmed, quietly, and there was no pride in her tone, no need to emphasize the scale of what she had built, because the results spoke clearly enough. Ethan leaned back slightly, his mind moving through the implications, the timelines, the execution, and for the first time since the crisis began, the path forward did not feel like a compromise. It felt like a recalibration. This will change everything, he said, his voice lower now, more reflective, and Amara met his gaze without hesitation. It should, she replied, and the certainty in her voice did not challenge him. It anchored him. The silence that followed was different from before, not heavy, not tense, but focused, as if both of them had stepped into the same space of understanding, and Ethan allowed himself a brief moment to sit within it, to feel the shift not just in the company, but in himself. What do you need from me? He asked. And this time the question carried no resistance, no negotiation, just clarity, and Amara's response came without delay. Access, she said, not approval. And the distinction landed cleanly, removing the final layer of control he had held onto without realizing it. Ethan's fingers rested lightly against the table, and he nodded once, the movement small but definitive, because the request was not about authority, it was about trust, and he understood that difference now in a way he had not before. You will have it, he said, and the words were not conditional, not framed by limitations, they were direct, complete. And Amara's gaze held his for a second longer, as if confirming that what he had just given was real, not strategic. She closed the folder slowly, the sound soft against the surface of the table, and leaned back slightly, her posture still composed, still grounded, but there was a shift now, subtle but present, as if the foundation of what they were building had just settled into place. Then we start immediately, she said, and Ethan nodded again, already moving through the steps, the calls, the restructuring of priorities, but this time the movement felt different, not driven by urgency alone, but by alignment. He stood after a moment, adjusting his jacket slightly, the gesture familiar but the context entirely new, and he looked down at her, not from a position of authority, but from one of acknowledgement. You turned a moment into a system, he said, his voice quiet, almost reflective, and Amara stood as well, meeting him at eye level, her expression unchanged, but her presence steady, unwavering. I turned it into a standard, she replied, and the words carried something deeper than ambition, something rooted in principle, in the decision she had made years ago in a space that had offered her nothing but the opportunity to define herself. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer, the meaning of that distinction settling fully, because a system could be replicated, adjusted, replaced, but a standard defined everything that came after. And he understood now that what she had built was not just a solution to his problem, it was a framework that would outlast both of them. They stood there for a moment, the city stretching behind them, unchanged and constant, but the space between them no longer defined by past or present alone. It was something else. Now, something built on a single moment that had expanded beyond its original shape, and Ethan turned toward the exit without hesitation, not because the conversation was finished, but because it had already given him everything he needed to move forward. As he walked toward the elevator, the silence followed him, not empty, not heavy, but clear, and for the first time in a long time. He did not feel like he was carrying the weight of everything alone, not because it had been taken from him, but because it had been restructured into something he could finally sustain. The elevator doors closed behind Ethan Caldwell with a soft, controlled finality, and as the car descended without sound, he did not check his phone, did not review the projections, did not replay the collapse in his mind the way he had done every hour since the crisis began, because something had shifted in a way that did not require repetition, only execution. When the doors opened into the quiet lobby, the same receptionist gave a slight nod, her composure unchanged, as if nothing significant had occurred above, and Ethan stepped out into the evening air where the city resumed its constant motion. But this time it felt different, not because it had changed, but because his position within it had. The car door closed behind him as he settled into the back seat, and the moment the vehicle pulled away from the curb, his phone came alive again, a series of alerts lighting up the screen in rapid succession. But instead of reacting immediately, he let them accumulate for a second longer than usual, as if acknowledging the difference between urgency and importance. And then he unlocked the screen, not to respond, but to initiate. The first call connected on the second ring, his chief operating officer answering with a tone that carried both expectation and concern. But Ethan spoke before the greeting could complete, his voice steady, clear. "We are restructuring effective immediately." And the words did not rise, did not demand attention. They simply established direction, and on the other end there was a brief silence before the response came, measured but alert. What kind of restructuring? And Ethan's gaze shifted toward the window, the city lights passing in smooth patterns. "Full operational decentralization," he said, and even without seeing the reaction, he could feel the shift in the line, the recalibration of everything that had been assumed about the next steps. "That is a complete overhaul," the voice replied, and Ethan did not hesitate. "It is necessary," he said, the tone leaving no room for interpretation, not because he needed to assert control, but because he no longer questioned the direction. The next hour unfolded in a sequence of calls, each one precise, each one aligned with the same objective: access without delay, authority redistributed, systems reevaluated not as extensions of his oversight, but as independent structures capable of sustaining themselves under pressure. And as the instructions moved outward through the organization, the initial resistance that surfaced was not unexpected, but it was also not engaged, because Ethan did not argue the change, he implemented it. By the time the car reached his building, the foundation of the company had already begun to shift, quietly but decisively. And when he stepped back into the penthouse, the silence that greeted him was no longer heavy. It was clear, defined, like a space waiting to be used rather than endured. He moved directly to the study, pulling up the central systems on his screen. But instead of positioning himself at the center as he had always done, he began mapping the transition points, identifying where control needed to be released, where access needed to be granted, and each decision, each adjustment carried the same underlying principle, not efficiency, but resilience. Across the city, in a space that remained quiet and controlled, Amara Brooks stood by the window, her reflection layered against the skyline as she observed the movement unfolding in real time, not through headlines or speculation, but through data streams that updated with quiet precision. Each shift within Caldwell Dynamics appearing not as a reaction, but as alignment. And she did not smile, did not express satisfaction, because this was not a moment of victory, it was a moment of confirmation. She turned slightly, moving toward a secondary console where her team had already begun integrating the new structure into their models, not to override, not to replace, but to support, to stabilize. And she placed her hand lightly against the surface, her gaze steady as she spoke. "He is moving faster than expected." And one of the analysts glanced up briefly, not surprised, but attentive. "Do we proceed with phase 2? They asked, and Amara considered the question for a fraction of a second. Before nodding, "We proceed," she said, her voice calm, because the timing was no longer theoretical, it was active. Back in the penthouse, Ethan paused for a moment, his hand resting against the edge of the desk as he reviewed the latest updates. And for the first time in days, the numbers on the screen did not feel like a countdown. They felt like a transition. The red indicators stabilizing not because the problem had disappeared, but because the system responding to it had changed. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message rather than a call, and he glanced down briefly, recognizing the sender immediately, but he did not open it right away, instead allowing the moment to settle, to exist without immediate reaction, because not every connection required instant response. When he finally tapped the screen, the message was short, direct, access confirmed, and he read it once, then again. Not because the words were unclear, but because of what they represented: a line crossed, a structure opened, a level of trust established without condition. He set the phone down slowly, his gaze lifting toward the window, and for a moment, the city stretched out in front of him not as something to control, but as something to move within, and he exhaled, the breath steady, grounded, because what had begun as a collapse had become something else entirely, something that required not just action, but change. The hours that followed did not blur together the way they had before. Each one carried intention, each decision aligned with a direction that was no longer reactive, and across the organization, the impact began to take shape, departments adjusting, communication lines shifting, authority redistributing not as a loss, but as a gain in flexibility. And while uncertainty remained, it no longer dominated the structure, it was absorbed by it. As the night moved deeper into early morning, Ethan remained in the study, not out of necessity, but out of presence, because this was no longer about managing a crisis, it was about understanding a transformation. And when the first light of dawn began to touch the edges of the skyline, he stepped back from the desk, the systems continuing without his direct input, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to stand still, not calculating, not planning, just observing the result of a decision that had changed more than just the outcome. Somewhere across the city, in a space that remained quiet and controlled, Amara stood in the same position she had held hours earlier, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. But there was a subtle shift in the air around her, not visible, not spoken, just present, as if something long set in motion had finally begun to take form, and she did not reach for her phone, did not check for confirmation, because she did not need to. She already knew the direction the moment had taken, and she allowed it to continue without interference, the way she had always intended. The first light of morning did not rush the city. It revealed it slowly, sliding across glass towers and quiet streets in a way that made everything look momentarily still, and inside the penthouse Ethan Caldwell stood with that same stillness. Not because there was nothing left to do, but because for the first time in years, the system he had built no longer required him to move first. The screens behind him continued to update. Numbers shifting, indicators stabilizing, not dramatically, not with the kind of sudden reversal that made headlines, but with something more important, consistency, and he watched it not as a man trying to control the outcome, but as someone learning how to trust a structure that extended beyond him. His phone rested on the desk within reach, silent for a rare moment, and when it finally lit up again, the notification was different, not a warning, not a projection, but a confirmation from one of the regional leads, a division that had already begun operating independently under the new model, reporting not to him directly, but to the system itself. And Ethan picked up the phone, reading the message carefully before responding with a single word: continue, because that was all that was needed now. Across the city, in a space where time moved with deliberate control, Amara Brooks stepped away from the console as the final integration reports aligned with her projections, and she did not linger over the data, did not recheck what had already proven itself, because her focus had never been on maintaining control, only on establishing it correctly. And she moved toward the window once more, her reflection steady against the skyline as the morning light sharpened the edges of everything. Behind her, the team continued their work without interruption, each person operating within a structure that did not depend on constant oversight, and she allowed that to continue without interference, because the moment had already shifted from execution to observation. Back in the penthouse, Ethan moved through the space with a quieter rhythm, not slower, not hesitant, just more precise. And he paused briefly at the edge of the desk where the original projection still sat. The red indicators now softened into something more neutral, something transitional. And he placed his hand lightly against the surface, not to steady himself, but to acknowledge the distance between where he had been and where he now stood. The shift had not erased the pressure, it had redistributed it, and that difference changed everything. A call came through from his chief financial officer, and this time Ethan answered without delay, the conversation direct, focused, outlining the early effects of the restructuring. Liquidity stabilizing in key sectors, operational flow increasing as bottlenecks dissolved. And Ethan listened without interruption, absorbing each detail, not as validation, but as confirmation that the direction held. "It is working," the voice said, and Ethan's gaze moved toward the window again. The city fully awake now, movement returning to every street, every building, and he allowed himself a small pause before responding. It was always going to. Because the confidence no longer came from assumption, it came from understanding. The call ended, and for a moment, the penthouse felt larger, not emptier, just more open, as if the space itself had adjusted to the shift in how it was being used. He stepped away from the desk, moving toward the kitchen where the morning light reflected off clean surfaces, and he poured himself a glass of water, the simple act grounding him in a way that no projection ever had. And as he took a slow sip, his mind did not race ahead to the next crisis, the next deal, the next outcome. It remained present, focused on the structure that was now in motion. Across the city, Amara turned slightly as one of her analysts approached, tablet in hand, and there was no urgency in their movement, only precision. "All sectors have transitioned to Phase 2 alignment," they said, and she nodded once, acknowledging the update without shifting her focus. "Maintain monitoring," she replied, her tone steady, because oversight did not require interference, only awareness. The analysts stepped back, returning to their station, and the room continued its quiet rhythm, each action aligned with a system that no longer depended on a single point of control. Back in the penthouse, Ethan set the glass down and walked back toward the study. His steps measured, his posture relaxed but intentional, and as he entered the space, he noticed the envelope from the night before still resting on the desk, unchanged, and he picked it up again, turning it slightly in his hand, not because he needed to read it, but because he understood now what it represented, not an invitation, not a coincidence, but a continuation. He placed it back down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the desk, and for a moment he stood there, looking at the systems running without his direct input, the company moving forward, without the constant weight of his control, and he felt something settle within him, something that had been building since the moment he walked into that room and saw her again. His phone buzzed once more, and this time the message came from a source he did not ignore, a single line appearing on the screen, Phase 1 complete, and he read it slowly, not because it required interpretation, but because it carried significance beyond the words themselves. He typed a response without overthinking it, understood, and set the phone down again, not waiting for a reply, because he did not need one. The day continued to unfold without the urgency that had defined the previous ones. Meetings adjusted, schedules realigned, but nothing felt rushed, nothing felt forced, and as the hours passed, the structure held, not because it was perfect, but because it was balanced. Across the city, Amara stepped away from the window for the first time since the morning began, moving toward the center of the room where the table remained clear, untouched, and she placed her hands lightly against its surface, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. But there was a quiet shift in the air around her, not visible, not spoken, just present, as if something long set in motion had reached its first point of stability. She did not reach for her phone, did not check for further updates, because the system did not require constant confirmation, it required space to function, and she allowed that space without hesitation. Back in the penthouse, Ethan stood in the same position he had held hours earlier, but the weight had changed, not lifted, but redistributed into something he could carry differently. And as he looked out over the city once more, The reflection staring back at him no longer felt like a version of control. It felt like a version of alignment, something quieter, more deliberate, something that did not demand attention but held it regardless. And he understood then that what had begun as a moment of collapse had not been an ending at all. It had been the beginning of something structured enough to last. By midday, the city had fully reclaimed its rhythm, the streets below alive with movement that did not pause for private transformations. And inside the glass walls of Caldwell Dynamics, the shift that had begun quietly was now impossible to ignore, not because it was announced, but because it was felt in the way conversations changed, in the way decisions moved without hesitation, in the way people who had once waited for approval were now acting with clarity. Ethan Caldwell stood at the far end of the main operations floor, not elevated above it, not separated behind glass as he had been before, but present within it, his posture composed, his gaze steady as he observed the system in motion. And what he saw was not chaos, not fragmentation, but something structured, something responsive, a network of moving parts no longer bottlenecked by a single point of control. A division lead approached him, tablet in hand, their steps measured but confident, and there was no trace of the uncertainty that had defined the previous days. Regional outputs are stabilizing ahead of projection, they said, their tone clear, and Ethan nodded once, not offering extended instruction, not redirecting, just acknowledging the alignment. The difference was subtle but absolute. Because leadership was no longer defined by constant intervention, it was defined by presence and direction. Across the city, Amara Brooks moved through her own space with the same quiet precision, her pace unhurried, her attention focused not on individual metrics but on the pattern forming across them. The way each segment of the system responded independently yet remained aligned. And she paused briefly near one of the large displays, her eyes scanning the data without lingering, because what she was looking for was not confirmation of success, but signs of imbalance, small shifts that could grow if left unaddressed. One of her senior analysts stepped closer, holding out a report. Public response is beginning to shift, they said, and Amara took the tablet, her gaze steady as she reviewed the headlines, the tone no longer speculative or critical, but cautious, curious, as if the narrative itself had begun to adjust in response to something it did not fully understand. She handed the tablet back without comment, because public perception was not something she chased, it was something that followed structure when it proved itself over time. Back on the operations floor, Ethan moved toward a central table where multiple teams had gathered, not in confusion, but in coordination, their discussions overlapping in a controlled rhythm, and he placed his hand lightly against the edge of the surface, grounding himself not out of necessity, but out of awareness, because this was the result of a decision he had not made alone. And he understood now that acknowledging that fact was part of what allowed the system to function. A voice from across the table caught his attention, outlining a cross-division adjustment that would have required his direct approval only days ago, and he listened without interruption, allowing the process to unfold without stepping into it, because the authority to act had already been distributed. When the discussion reached its conclusion, the team lead glanced toward him briefly, not for permission, but for confirmation, and Ethan gave a slight nod, a gesture that did not grant power, but recognized its proper use. The shift was complete. In that moment, not declared, not marked, but understood, across the city, Amara stepped into a smaller, quieter room, a space designed not for oversight, but for reflection, and she closed the door softly behind her, allowing the outside activity to fade into a distant hum. And for the first time since the process began, she sat down, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her posture still composed. But the stillness now carried something different, something deeper, because this was not the beginning of the work, it was the confirmation of it. Her mind moved briefly, not through projections or systems, but through memory, not to dwell, not to revisit, but to acknowledge the path that had led here, the moment in the rain that had not defined her, but had set a standard she chose to carry forward, and she exhaled slowly, the breath steady, grounded, because what had been built was not tied to a single outcome. It was designed to sustain itself beyond any one moment. Back at Caldwell Dynamics, Ethan stepped into a conference room where a smaller group had assembled, executives who had once operated in close orbit around his decisions, and now sat in a configuration that reflected the new structure. Their positions adjusted not by hierarchy, but by function, and he took his seat without addressing the shift directly, because it did not need explanation, it needed continuation. Report, he said simply, his tone even, and one by one they outlined their sectors, not as isolated updates, but as interconnected parts of a system that now moved with greater fluidity, and Ethan listened, not searching for control points, but for alignment, and each report confirmed what he had already begun to understand. The company was no longer reacting to pressure, it was absorbing it. When the final update concluded, the room fell into a brief silence, not uncertain, not tense, but expectant, and Ethan allowed it to remain for a moment before speaking again, his voice calm, deliberate. Maintain structure, he said, the instruction simple, but carrying the weight of everything that had changed, and the group nodded, not out of obligation, but out of shared understanding. Across the city, Amara stood once more, moving back into the main space where her team continued their work without interruption, and she did not announce the progress, did not mark the milestone, because the system did not require recognition to validate it. It required consistency to sustain it. And she moved toward the window again, her reflection merging with the skyline, her gaze steady as she observed the city not as something to influence, but as something to move within. Her phone remained untouched on the table behind her, a silent presence that did not demand attention, because the connection between what she had built and what was unfolding did not need constant communication. It existed within the structure itself. Back in the headquarters, Ethan stood once more at the edge of the floor, the movement around him steady, purposeful, and for a moment he allowed himself to step back internally, to observe not just the company, but his place within it. And what he saw was not a loss of control, but a redistribution of it, something that had not diminished his position, but refined it. He turned slightly, his gaze moving across the space one last time before heading toward his office, not to retreat, but to continue the work from a different position, one that no longer required him to hold everything together alone. And as the day moved forward, the transformation that had begun in silence continued in that same quiet way, not announced, not celebrated, but evident in every action, every decision, every moment where the system held, not because it was forced to, but because it had been built to do exactly that. The late afternoon light stretched long across the glass walls of Caldwell Dynamics, casting reflections that moved slowly as the city shifted into its next rhythm. And inside the building, the transformation that had begun in quiet precision was now settling into something steady, something that no longer felt like change, but like structure. Ethan Caldwell stood near the far end of his office, the door open behind him, no longer separating him from the movement of the floor, and his gaze moved across the space with a clarity that had not existed days before, because what he was observing now was not a recovery, it was a recalibration that had already taken hold. The reports continued to come in, but their tone had shifted, no longer urgent, no longer reactive. They carried a consistency that did not need to prove itself. And as he reviewed them, he noticed something that could not be measured in numbers alone. The decisions being made across divisions were no longer waiting for alignment, they were operating within it. A soft knock at the open door drew his attention, and his chief operating officer stepped inside, holding a tablet but not leading with it. External markets are responding, they said, their tone controlled but carrying a quiet sense of recognition, and Ethan nodded once, gesturing slightly for them to continue. The narrative has changed, they added, turning the screen slightly, so he could see the shift. Headlines that had once predicted collapse now, questioning the speed of recovery, analysts revising their positions not out of certainty, but out of observation, and Ethan looked at it for a moment before turning his gaze back toward the floor, because he understood that perception would always follow structure when it held. Let it catch up, he said simply, and the instruction carried no urgency, no need to control the narrative, because that was no longer the focus. Across the city, Amara Brooks stood in a space that remained quiet despite the movement around it, her presence unchanged, her attention focused not on the surface reactions, but on the deeper alignment beneath them, and she moved through the room with the same measured pace, stopping briefly at a console where a new set of projections had just finalized, not predictions, but confirmations of stability, and she reviewed them without expression, not because they lacked importance, but because they met the standard she had already set. One of her team members approached with a slight hesitation, not uncertainty, but awareness. The board from Caldwell Dynamics has requested a formal statement, they said, and Amara's gaze lifted slightly, not surprised, but thoughtful, because the request itself reflected a shift in understanding. She considered it for a moment, then shook her head once. No statement, she replied, her voice calm. They do not need one. And the simplicity of it carried more meaning than any public declaration could have, because what had been established did not require explanation. It required continuation. Back at the headquarters, Ethan stepped away from his desk, moving toward the main floor once more, not out of necessity, but out of alignment. And as he walked through the space, the movement around him did not slow, did not pause, because it no longer depended on his presence to function, and that difference settled into him with a quiet clarity, not as distance, but as balance. He paused briefly near one of the collaborative tables, observing a group as they worked through a cross-division adjustment, their discussion focused, efficient, and when one of them glanced up and met his gaze, there was no hesitation, no need for confirmation, just a shared understanding that the structure held. He gave a slight nod, acknowledging the moment, and continued walking, not inserting himself, not redirecting, because leadership now existed in the space between action and trust. The elevator ride back to the upper floor was silent, the glass walls revealing the city in motion below, and Ethan stood with his hands at his sides, not reviewing data, not preparing responses, just allowing the moment to exist without filling it, because he understood now that not every second required input to maintain control. When the doors opened, he stepped out into the quieter corridor that led back to his office, and as he entered, his gaze moved immediately to the desk where the envelope still rested, unchanged, and for a moment, he stood there, looking at it not as a reminder, but as a marker, a point in time where everything had shifted direction. He walked over and picked it up again, turning it slightly in his hand, and this time, the weight of it felt different, not as a question, but as an answer he had already begun to understand. Across the city, Amara stood once more by the window, the skyline reflecting across the glass as the sun lowered, and her posture remained steady, her presence unchanged. But there was a quiet stillness now that carried something more complete, not an end, but a point of stability that allowed the system to continue without constant intervention. Her phone remained on the table behind her, untouched, and she did not reach for it, because she did not need to confirm what was already in motion. Back in his office, Ethan set the envelope down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the desk as he had done before, and he moved toward the window, the city stretching out before him in layers of light and movement. And for the first time since the crisis had begun, he did not see it as something to conquer or control. He saw it as something to move within, something that required structure rather than dominance. His phone buzzed softly against the desk, and he turned slightly, picking it up without urgency, and the message on the screen was brief, direct, alignment holding. And he read it once, then again, not because it required interpretation, but because it reflected something that had been built with intention. He typed a response without hesitation, continue as planned, and set the phone back down, his gaze returning to the skyline. Because the next steps no longer required constant adjustment, they required consistency. The light outside shifted gradually, the city moving toward evening, and inside the office the quiet remained, not empty, not heavy, but clear, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer, not thinking ahead, not revisiting the past, just present in the structure that now existed around him. And in that stillness, he understood something that had not been clear before, that what had been given to him years ago had not been a moment of help. It had been a foundation, something that had grown beyond its origin into something capable of sustaining more than just one outcome. And as he turned away from the window, moving back toward the desk, his steps measured, his posture steady, there was no urgency in his movement, only intention, because the system no longer depended on how fast he reacted. It depended on how well he understood what had already been set in motion. The evening settled across the city with a quiet confidence, the kind that did not demand attention but held it anyway. And inside the upper floors of Caldwell Dynamics, the atmosphere carried that same tone, no longer reactive, no longer strained, but measured, deliberate, as if the entire structure had found a rhythm it had not known before. Ethan Caldwell stood at his desk. The lights dimmed slightly to reflect the shift from day to night, and the screens in front of him no longer pulsed with urgency. They moved steadily, data flowing in a way that felt controlled without being constrained, and he rested his hands lightly against the edge of the surface, not gripping, not bracing, just present. A message appeared quietly on the central display, not flagged, not highlighted, just integrated into the flow, and he read it without leaning forward. Long-term projections adjusted, and the numbers that followed did not promise immediate recovery. They suggested something more sustainable, something built to hold over time, and he allowed that to settle without reaction, because the absence of urgency was now its own form of confirmation. Across the city, Amara Brooks moved through her space with the same steady pace she had maintained from the beginning, her presence unchanged by the visible shifts around her. And she paused briefly near the main console where a new layer of data had been integrated, not operational, not structural, but behavioral, tracking how decisions propagated through the system now that control had been redistributed, and she observed it not as an analyst, but as an architect, looking for patterns that indicated not just function, but understanding. One of her team members approached. With a quiet step, their tone respectful but direct. Internal culture metrics are shifting, they said, holding out a tablet, and Amara took it, her eyes scanning the summary without rushing, seeing the changes not in percentages, but in movement, teams communicating laterally rather than vertically, decisions forming at the edges rather than the center, and she handed the tablet back with a small nod, because this was the part that mattered most, the part that could not be forced, only enabled. Back in his office, Ethan turned slightly, moving toward the window as the city lights began to sharpen against the darkening sky, and his reflection appeared faintly in the glass, layered over the movement below, and for a moment he stood there, not thinking ahead, not reviewing what had already happened, just observing the alignment between the system outside and the one he had just stepped into within his own company. The shift was not dramatic, it was not visible to those who looked only for surface change, but to him it was absolute. And he exhaled slowly, the breath steady, grounded, because what he had gained was not control in the traditional sense, it was clarity. A soft knock at the door broke the stillness, and he turned slightly as his chief financial officer stepped in, their posture composed but carrying a subtle sense of resolution. "We are no longer at risk of immediate collapse," they said, their voice calm, and Ethan nodded once, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, because the outcome had already been understood before it was confirmed. "Maintain current structure," he replied, his tone even, and the instruction did not extend beyond that, because it did not need to, and the officer gave a slight nod before stepping back, the door closing softly behind them. Across the city, Amara stepped into the same quiet room she had used earlier, the door closing behind her with a controlled movement, and she allowed herself a brief moment of stillness, her hands resting lightly against the surface of the table, her posture unchanged, but her attention shifting inward, not to question, not to reconsider, but to acknowledge the completion of a phase that had been set in motion long before it became visible. Her thoughts moved briefly through the path that had led here, not in detail, not in narrative, but in structure, the decision to build without dependence, to create systems that did not require validation to function. And she exhaled slowly, the breath measured, because the work had not ended. It had simply reached a point where it could continue without her constant presence. Back in the office, Ethan returned to the desk, his movements unhurried, and he picked up the envelope once more, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, and as he held it, he understood that what it represented had already been fulfilled, not in a single moment, but across the entire transformation that had taken place. He placed it back down carefully, aligning it once more, and his gaze moved across the room, taking in the space not as a place of authority, but as part of a larger system that no longer revolved solely around him. His phone buzzed softly, and he picked it up, the message brief, Precise, stability confirmed. And he read it once, then again, not because it required confirmation, but because it reflected something deeper than the words themselves, a shift that could not be undone by a single moment of pressure. He typed a response without hesitation. Proceed to next phase. And set the phone down again, his gaze returning to the screens, not to monitor, but to observe, because the system now functioned with or without his constant input. The evening deepened outside, the city lights fully alive now, and inside the office the quiet remained, not empty, not tense, but defined, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer, his posture steady, his presence grounded. And in that stillness he recognized something that had not been clear before, that the value of what had been built was not in its ability to withstand collapse, but in its ability to evolve beyond it. Across the city, Amara stepped back out into the main space, her team still moving with quiet efficiency, and she did not interrupt, did not redirect, because the structure held, and she moved toward the window once more, her reflection merging with the skyline, her gaze steady, not seeking confirmation, not expecting acknowledgement, just observing the continuation of something she had set into motion years ago. Her phone remained untouched, resting on the table behind her, because the connection between what she had built and what was now unfolding did not require constant communication. It existed within the alignment itself. Back in the office, Ethan turned away from the window, moving toward the center of the room, his steps measured, his posture composed. And as he did, the weight that had once defined his role no longer rested solely on him. It had been distributed, reshaped into something sustainable, and he understood then that what had begun as a moment of crisis had revealed something far more valuable, a way of building that did not rely on a single point of control, but on a shared standard. And as he settled back into the space, not as the center, but as part of the system, the quiet around him did not feel like absence. It felt like balance. The night settled deeper over the city, not with silence, but with a steadier rhythm, a kind of quiet confidence that followed a day where something fundamental had shifted, and inside Caldwell Dynamics the building no longer carried the tension it had held just days before. Instead it moved with a controlled flow that did not need constant correction. Ethan Caldwell stood alone once more in his office, but the isolation no longer felt like pressure, it felt like space, and he allowed himself to remain still for a moment longer than usual, his hands resting lightly at his sides as the reflection of the skyline stretched across the glass in front of him. The systems behind him continued to run, data updating without interruption, and for the first time since he had built the company, he did not feel the need to turn around and check every detail, because the structure no longer depended on his immediate presence to hold. A soft notification appeared on the edge of the screen, not urgent, not highlighted, and he walked over, glancing at it without leaning in. The message simple. Independent divisions exceeded stabilization targets, and he read it once, then again. Not because it required confirmation, but because it represented something deeper than success. It represented sustainability. He reached out and dimmed the display slightly, reducing the brightness so the room returned to its natural balance, and he stepped back, allowing the quiet to settle fully, because what had been built now required observation more than intervention. Across the city, Amara Brooks stood in the same position she had occupied for most of the evening, her presence unchanged, her posture steady as she observed the final wave of adjustments ripple through the system. And she did not track every detail, did not monitor every output, because she understood the difference between control and design, and what she had created was no longer something that required her constant attention to function. One of her senior team members approached slowly, their steps measured, aware of the stillness in the room. All systems have reached baseline stability, they said, their voice calm, and Amara turned slightly, her gaze meeting theirs for a brief moment before she nodded once, acknowledging the completion of a phase that had been years in the making. Then we stepped back, she replied, her tone even, and the instruction was not about withdrawal, it was about trust, about allowing the structure to exist without constant reinforcement. The team member nodded and stepped away, returning to their station, and the room resumed its quiet rhythm, each movement aligned with something larger than individual oversight. Back in the office, Ethan walked slowly toward the desk, his steps measured, not out of caution, but out of awareness, and he reached for the envelope once more, holding it for a moment longer than before, not because it contained new information, but because it marked the point where everything had begun to shift, and as he looked at it, he understood that the moment it represented was no longer isolated. It had expanded into something that now defined the direction of everything that followed. He placed it back down carefully, aligning it once more, and his gaze moved across the room, taking in the space with a different understanding, because what had once been a center of control was now part of a broader system that no longer required a single point to hold it together. His phone buzzed softly against the surface, and he picked it up without urgency, the message brief, precise, external confidence rising. And he read it once before setting the phone down again, not responding immediately, because he understood now that external perception would follow internal alignment without being forced. Across the city, Amara moved away from the window for the first time in hours, her steps quiet as she crossed the room toward the table where her phone rested untouched, and she paused briefly before picking it up, her gaze steady as she read the same signals reflected through her own systems, not as headlines, but as data points that confirmed the shift she had already anticipated. She did not respond, did not initiate contact, because the connection between what she had built and what was now unfolding did not require constant reinforcement. It existed within the structure itself. She placed the phone back down and turned slightly, her attention returning to the space around her, and for a moment she allowed herself to stand still, not analyzing, not adjusting, just acknowledging the completion of something that had been carried forward from a single moment years ago into something far larger than its origin. Back in the office, Ethan stepped away from the desk once more, moving toward the window as the city lights stretched out below, and his reflection appeared faintly in the glass, layered over the movement outside, and he stood there, not calculating, not planning, just observing the alignment between what existed within him and what now existed within the system he had built. The shift was complete, not in the sense that there was nothing left to do, but in the sense that the foundation had changed, and he exhaled slowly, the breath steady, grounded, because the pressure that had once defined his role no longer rested entirely on him. It had been redistributed into something sustainable. A final message appeared on the screen behind him, not flagged, not emphasized, transition complete, and he turned, slightly, glancing at it for a brief moment before turning back toward the window, because the confirmation did not require his attention to validate it. Across the city, Amara stood once more by the window, her reflection steady against the skyline, and for the first time since the process began, there was a subtle shift in her expression, not a smile, not a reaction, just a quiet release of tension that had never been visible to anyone else. And she allowed herself that moment without extending it, because the work had not been about reaching an end. It had been about creating something that could continue beyond it. The night deepened, the city moving forward as it always did, and in two separate spaces connected not by distance but by design. Both Ethan and Amara stood in quiet stillness, no longer defined by the roles they had once held, but by the structure they now shared, something built not on control, not on dependency, but on a standard that had been set long before. Either of them fully understood its value, and as the hours moved forward, that standard remained, not as a memory, not as a moment, but as a foundation that would continue to shape everything that followed. The city did not pause for endings. It moved forward with the same steady rhythm it had always carried, and yet something within that rhythm had shifted in a way that could not be measured by traffic or light or time. And inside Caldwell Dynamics, the building reflected that change not through noise or celebration, but through consistency, through the quiet confidence of a system that had proven it could hold. Ethan Caldwell stood in the center of his office, not behind the desk, not near the window, but in the space between, a place he had rarely occupied before, and his posture was steady, his presence grounded, as if he had finally stepped into a position that did not require him to define it. The screens around him continued their quiet flow of information, but he did not turn to them immediately, because he no longer needed to confirm what he already understood, and when he finally moved, it was not toward the data, but toward the envelope that still rested on the desk, unchanged, its edges sharp against the surface. He picked it up one last time, holding it with a familiarity that had not existed before, And for a moment he allowed the weight of it to settle, not as a question, not as a memory, but as a completed line in something much larger. He turned it over slowly, his fingers steady, and then placed it back down with intention, not aligning it this time, not adjusting its position, just leaving it where it was, because it no longer needed to mark a point of transition. It had become part of the foundation. Across the city, Amara Brooks stood by the window as she had so many times before, but the stillness around her carried a different tone now, not anticipation, not observation, but completion, and she allowed herself to remain there for a moment longer, her reflection layered against the skyline, her gaze steady as the lights stretched outward in every direction. Behind her, the system she had built continued without interruption, the team moving with quiet precision, each action aligned with a structure that no longer required her to guide it moment by moment. And she did not turn back immediately, did not step into the flow, because she understood that what she had set in motion had reached a point where it could sustain itself. Back in the office, Ethan finally moved toward the window, his steps measured, his posture relaxed in a way that did not diminish his presence, but refined it. And as he looked out over the city, the reflection, staring back at him, no longer carried the same weight it once had. It was not a symbol of control, it was a representation of alignment, of something that existed within a larger system rather than above it. His phone buzzed softly on the desk, and he turned slightly, picking it up without urgency. The message brief, precise, all divisions operating independently within structure. And he read it once, then again, not because it required confirmation, but because it marked something final, something that did not need to be declared to be understood. He typed a response slowly, deliberately, maintained standard, and set the phone down again, his gaze returning to the skyline, because the next phase did not require acceleration, it required consistency. Across the city, Amara turned away from the window at the same moment, her movement smooth, controlled, and she walked toward the center of the room where the table remained clear, untouched, and she placed her hands lightly against its surface, not to steady herself, but to acknowledge the space where everything had converged, and she allowed herself a single breath, slow and measured, before stepping back. Her phone remained on the table, silent, and she did not reach for it, because she did not need confirmation of what she had already seen, and instead she moved toward the exit, her steps quiet, her posture unchanged, and as she reached the door, she paused briefly, not in hesitation, but in recognition, because what she was leaving behind was not unfinished, it was complete in the way it had been designed to be. Back in the office, Ethan stepped away from the window, his movement deliberate, and he crossed the room without looking back, not because the view had lost its significance, but because it no longer defined his position within it. And as he reached the door, he paused for a moment, his hand resting lightly against the frame, the space behind him quiet, stable, and he allowed himself to acknowledge it, not with words, not with reaction, but with understanding. He stepped out into the corridor, the building moving around him with a rhythm that no longer required his direction to sustain itself. And as he walked forward, his presence did not interrupt that flow. It moved within it, aligned, integrated, part of something that extended beyond him. Across the city, Amara stepped out into the evening air, the coolness settling around her as the sounds of the street rose and fell in the background. And she did not look back at the building behind her, because she understood that what she had created did not remain tied to a single place. It existed wherever the standard was upheld, and she moved forward without hesitation, her pace steady, her direction clear. The distance between them remained, not as separation, but as design. Two individuals moving within the same system without needing to converge, without needing to redefine what had already been established. And as the city continued its motion, the structure they had shaped held its place within it, not visible to those who did not look for it, but present in every decision, every movement, every moment where control gave way to alignment. And in that quiet, in that balance, the story did not end with recognition or reunion. It settled into something more enduring, a standard carried forward without announcement, without demand, simply existing as proof that what begins as a single act, given without condition, can evolve into something that does not just change a moment, but reshapes everything that follows.